Thank you all for coming tonight. Let's say I come at this from a slightly different direction. So my own research focuses mainly on social movements in the United States, interest in right-wing politics, interest in political parties. But when I was first asked to do this, to be honest, I don't normally think of a lot of these organizations in the context of fascist. And so this pushed me to think about what we mean fascist. And I think this is something that we've all kind of discussed tonight, so I'll leave some of this for the discussion. But I should say, when I'm talking about the groups tonight, I did try to narrow it down to fascist or fascist-ish organizations in the United States. So this is excluding a bunch of very far-right organizations that are potentially of interest or terrifying, depending on who you are, including militia movements, 3%ers, all these sort of Christian identity groups that are very violent in the rhetoric, but aren't what I would consider fascist. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of the three generations of fascist organizations in the United States that are still sort of around and active. Spending a little bit more time on the most recent group that has just appeared over basically the last year and a half. Talk a little bit about the alt-right and fascism, since the alt-right has often been conflated with this term and is very poorly defined and is probably even less useful than fascist. And then finally, I want to end by talking about what are these groups actually doing, which I think is very important to understand, especially given that we are on a college campus and many of these organizations are very much oriented towards college students. So first off, there are a lot of fascist and fascist-related organizations in the United States. You can sort of break down from the groups that are still currently active, sort of three different generations I saw. Some of the older generations, which are more traditional organizations. So these have members, they have leadership. The National Socialist Movement is still somewhat prominent today. These groups generally hold ideology that are oriented around building a white nation state in the United States. They oppose diversity. They have strong views on a variety of foreign policy issues. And also, they're very interrelated. So the National Socialist Movement came out of the National Alliance, if I'm correct here. The National Alliance may or may not still exist. A lot of these groups are really hard to pin down. We'll talk more about that in a second. Then there was the first wave of really internet organizations that appeared. So I should say, here I'm being very broad. The first is Stormfront. So this is an online forum that was basically the social network of choice for those on the far right. Still exists today, is not as popular, but it's still very prominent. You can still go on there if you want. It has neo-Nazis, white supremacists, anything on basically the far right. The second big group, here's another website, so there's a Daily Stormer. It's not, again, an organization, but still very important. It is instead a website, like a news blog almost, for far right thinking. Got relatively, again, was important, has recently been in the news if you've been paying attention because they lost, I can't remember if it's their hosting or their domain, and they have now had to turn to the dark web. You can't get to them online anymore. Multiple hosting platforms deny basically to host them. And then we have sort of the new wave of organizations that have appeared just recently. So Richard Spencer and his AltRight, which is both an organization and a term and a news service and is very confusing. The Traditionalist Worker Party, which was actually founded by a former student at Towson University in Maryland who had created a white students union on campus while he was there. When he graduated, he created the Traditionalist Youth Network, which then has morphed into this Traditionalist Worker Party and is by far the most typified fascist organization. We'll see a little bit of the literature later on. Identity Europa, who has been present on campus here, they deem themselves an identitarian organization. We'll talk about what that means too. Anti-Communist Action, which isn't so much as a fascist organization, but a anti-fascist organization, making them then sort of a pro-fascist organization, but they would deny that and would instead call themselves anti-communist and more libertarian. And then finally, Vanguard America, Patriot Front, there's some other basically smaller organizations. All these organizations are mixtures of basically organizations and platforms. So AltRight in particular, Richard Spencer, before he formed or before he created AltRight.com, was the head of the National Policy Institute, a think tank. This isn't an organization that you can really belong. It's a news service. You can belong to the Traditionalist Workers' Party. You can belong to Adetta Europa. It costs $10 a month. Or $100 a year if you want the discount. Yeah, and this makes it hard because a lot of these organizations, they do a lot online, but it's really hard to figure out actually who they are and who's involved with them. We can look at a few metrics. So, does anyone know what Patreon is? Does anyone know what Patreon is? So Patreon is a website that you can actually, donate to people. You pay monthly to be able to, donate to content creators. The fascists and the other racists got kicked off of Patreon, and trying to stay on brand, they made their own website, Patreon, instead. So you can donate to these groups and these individuals. So Richard Spencer gets $531 a month from donors on Patreon. The Daily Stormer has by far the most amount, but this isn't a whole lot. If you look at their online social media presence, Richard Spencer has the most at 70,000 some followers on his Twitter. But if you look at his actual website, AltRight, it has like 2,000 people on it. And then Europa has about 20,000 followers, Traditional Worker Party, 2,000. These are not exactly large organizations, but they have an outsized influence because of what they do. And we'll talk at the end. I should have probably done the AltRight thing first now that I think about this and talk about what they do right after this. But instead, we're going to talk about the AltRight, if the clicker works. Oh, sorry, we're going to talk a little bit more. So a lot of these organizations in the United States have developed around a single leader, and that means that when that single leader goes to jail, which they often do for either because they've done some violence against someone, or in some cases have been caught up in other crimes, the organization falls apart, or there's splinters because of elite leadership, so they tend to vanish. There's a lot of churn in these organizations. That's in fact why Vanguard America and Patriot Front, I'm not quite sure which one still exists. Patriot Front probably split off from Vanguard America. The leader went to Patriot Front, but he's still listed on Vanguard America, went on speaking bills, but his website goes to Patriot Front now, so I have no idea. But these organizations are driven by leaders when they are driven at all. And they aren't very rigid boundaries. So all these groups, people have maybe not membership in multiple groups, but they move between groups often. They create many different sort of federations. The most recent one is I think the Nationalist Front, they call it, which has a lot of these organizations that I've listed already as members, basically. Moving on to the AltRight. So the AltRight is not really a good term. Richard Spencer just kind of coined it to say that we are an alternative to the mainstream Republican right. It's been used in a variety of ways. Trying to get an idea of who is actually in it. This is data that was collected by an anonymous contributor to the website's goingdown.org using Facebook data on people who were RSVP'd as yes to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. I can't promise you that this data is accurate because I've not actually seen it, but given what I know, it doesn't seem inaccurate. And he or she went through and looked at the membership, the links that people had RSVP'd to, the likes that they had on their pages to other things. So if you'd liked other organizations, try to get an idea of who was actually going to this. So you see a lot of Southern nationalists, what here we're often talking about today, these sort of white nationalist groups, including the Traditionalist Worker Party, vague alt-right, the Proud Boys, and then these other kind of far-right, more libertarian organizations, the militia groups and Oath Keepers. So if we consider the Charlottesville Unite the Right incident as being a good indication of what the alt-right is, it is a mess of a bunch of different ideologies. Some take more traditional fascist positions, some just take general far-right positions on politics. And then some are more of social or cultural organizations and less explicitly ideological. So first, again, the Traditionalist Worker Party. Here are some of their, stickers I think you can buy on their website. And you can see very clear themes we've talked about tonight, that they oppose basically refugees into the United States, an idea of nationalism that's conflated with race and identity. Along with that, they have very clear economic policies too. They believe in what's called third way economics. So they think that both capitalism and communism is the problem, and that there can be a third way of economic solutions. And they're also very environmental. They have a lot of support for the environment because they believe that the United States is a white nation that should be protected for white people. So their environmentalism is rooted in this sense of identity and belonging to the United States. On the other side, probably the least of the fascist part of the alt-right is the Proud Boys. This is a very weird organization that is basically a frat for 30-year-olds and older. They were at AltRight after Charlottesville. They made their leader of sorts made some comments saying they're not actually part of the alt-right. This is as close to ideological positions that they've taken, and it's sort of all over the map as well as far as politics. So we have some traditional right wing, end welfare, give everyone a gun, right? So we support for gun rights. We also see abolish the prison, legalize drugs, and close the borders too, another very right wing. So it's one of the strangest mixes of politics I think I've actually ever seen. It is, and the leaders also talk about how he wished he could stop talking about politics. Instead he wants to talk about, basically masculinity. And that is where a lot of these organizations have overlap, is support for very traditional gender roles. Very strong beliefs that men should be men, women should be women. The problem with America is a lot that women have basically left the kitchen. That kind of very, very ugly rhetoric. Also deeply contentious with current political elites. Trump is sometimes included in that, sometimes excluded in that. There has been changes because Trump has changed. They do love violence against left-wing protesters, and there is this very deep online culture that's embedded in a lot of this. So you can see two of these coming together. For those of you that recognize the template, this is based off Wikipedia, and is celebrating what they've called the Third Battle of Berkeley, which is, I assume, the third time that left and right protesters fought in Berkeley. You can see both like the politics and the sort of online memes that exist in here. So we've got the belligerents of Open Society, which is George Soros' organization, and Saudi Arabia. We have the good people, the United States, the UK, Japan for some reason, and the Kyrgyzstan Republic. Yeah. So there is this weird, it's this combination of both nationalism as well as online internet culture come to life. And that's really where the alt-right is. And it's good, and I mean it's not good, but it's where a lot of this recruiting happens now. And so that kind of actually goes into what these groups are doing now. So a lot of these organizations have spread and created off the internet. So as I was talking about, they're deeply enmeshed in online culture. A lot of these came off of 4chan or Reddit subreddits. They have their own, like most political sects today, they have their own sort of media, including the Right Stuff, War Room, the Daily Stormer. And then over the last year, what's happened is a lot of these organizations have come offline for the first time in a big way. And what they've been doing is, of course, we know the rallies. So this is Unite the Right. A lot of the speakers, so Richard Spencer, Matt Heimbach is the leader of the Traditionalist Worker Party, Michael Paul is, the League of the South or whatever it is. These are the organizations we've seen. This is an upcoming rally actually on Saturday in Shelbyville, Tennessee, in response to perceptions of immigrants, or actually refugees being moved into there. Again, we see the same sort of organizations. And so they've been holding more and more rallies. They've also been focusing a lot on colleges, which goes back to a lot of what fascists have done historically, recruiting from middle-class youth often, actually. And so this is a postering that happened here at State College. This is an Identity Europa poster that I don't know where it's from, but that's also taken place here at Penn State. This is great because you don't need a lot of people to put up posters, and if you make them basically aggressive enough, you'll get media attention, you'll get people talking. You don't need to have more than 2-3 people to do this successfully. And then finally, this is what the far right and these fascist organizations have been doing since basically the 1940s, and that's rebranding and changing the conversation. So now, a lot of these organizations don't talk, they talk about how they are either race realists or identitarians. Both of these are positions that are trying to say that we accept that maybe the racism of our grandfather was wrong, but there's still something to it. Race realists say that if we look at the statistics enough, we can figure something out. Identitarians say that, well, everyone should have their own identity. And everyone's identity is wrapped up in this, cultural. And so we just want what others want too. One thing they love to talk about is white genocide. This is code for just demographic changes in the United States. So white genocide is the fact that whites will no longer be a majority in the United States by 2050 or whatever it's going to be. That to them is white genocide. And then they will also now speak of a support for diversity. What they mean in that context is that every race and every identity gets its own country. So they don't want diversity in the United States. They want the United States to be a pure white Christian Christian country. But non-whites can have their own country that exists separately, and we can trade and do other things, but we can't mix. So yeah, thank you all for having me here. I'm looking forward to talking about this and answering questions as well.